Welcome back to another video. In the last couple of videos, we were able to add state to our component and update that state by filtering out the photo that we decided to remove from the post property of our component state, which triggers a re-render of our photos based on the updated post property. In this video, we're going to look at different lifecycle methods of our components. The first lifecycle method is the constructor method. The constructor method gets called once, before our component instance is even mounted, before it is even inserted into the DOM. In the constructor, you don't ever want to include any side effect logic by changing the value of a variable, writing to it, or triggering a change in our UI. The constructor should only be used to initialize the state of our component, or bind methods to the proper context. Now notice that both the constructor and render method are naturally invoked during the life cycle of the component, without us having to actually call them, as opposed to how we're explicitly calling the remove method inside of the onClick handler for it to get called. Right now, as soon as we launch the app, so as soon as I refresh the page, render would get called. We're mapping over this array of 3 elements to generate these 3 photos. However, when our app first runs, instead of generating photos from an array, what if we wanted to fetch them all from a database? Now, we're not actually going to set up a database just to explain the concept. That would take up way too much time. But let's just simulate how we would fetch data from a database and then render it to our screen. Obviously, at first, let's just assume that this array is inside of some database. Therefore, we wouldn't initially have access to it. We would need to fetch it. So the post property of our initial component state would simply be an empty array. So we're going to specify it as such. And now let's just write out some function. Function simulate fetch from database. Which is simply going to return the array of photos. Obviously, this function is not really fetching any external data. All of the data still lives in our file. But just assume that this data that it's returning was inside of some external API, inside of a database somewhere. And by calling this function, let's assume that it's making an HTTP request, an asynchronous request to fetch that data, bring it back, and return it to us. Where would we then make that request? In the render method? That is a terrible idea. The render method in nature should never trigger any asynchronous code, AJAX request, or anything of that nature. The render method should only be responsible for rendering UI based on the props or states that are passed into it. AJAX request or any asynchronous API request should be done after the component is mounted, after it's inserted into the DOM and added to the view. This is the perfect use case for the lifecycle method component did mount. Because component did mount is invoked immediately after the component is being inserted into the DOM. The pattern is, before the component is inserted into the DOM, the constructor is invoked and initializes the component state with a post property of an empty array. The render method would then get called, passing in an empty array to map out the photos. But obviously the array is empty, so it's not really mapping over anything. If we were to check out the browser, we get nothing, which makes sense. We have an empty page because of our empty array, which maps over nothing. So no photos are generated in our photo wall component. That being said, the render method renders nothing at first. But then right after the component is inserted into the DOM, component did mount gets invoked and is supposed to fetch our data from an external API, which would then update the component state property posts with the data that it just fetched. So set a const of posts equal to the return value of our function simulate fetch data from database. Assume this was done through an asynchronous request. Once we're done fetching the data from our database, we will update the component state by writing this .setState. And here's a neat trick. If you don't need to access the current state of your component to update the new state, you can simply pass in an object. And in that object, declare the property you want to update, that being posts, which will equal the data that we supposedly fetched from our API, posts. Let's call this data just to make it more intuitive. Obviously, when we were removing photos, we needed the current state since we filtered out the picture that we wanted to remove from the posts in the current state, thereby updating the new state. In this case, we know the previous state is empty, so just set the new state equal to the data that we're fetching from the web. So quick diagram to summarize what we just did. Constructor sets the initial state of our component with 0 elements in the array. Render method is called. No pictures show up since the array that we're mapping over is empty. Then component did mount gets called right after the component instance was inserted into the DOM. Simulates an API request to grab the photos from a database and re-updates the component state such that the post property of our state is updated to the data that we just fetched. Since we updated the state, the render method gets called again. And with the updated post property of our state, it will re-render the UI. Let's go to our browser, and everything works out great. To further illustrate the sequence of events, put a console.log inside of the constructor. Console.log constructor, a console.log inside of component did mount, console.log component did mount, and a console.log inside of render. Console.log render. Back to our project, open up the developer tool, and there you have it. The constructor initializes the state with 0 elements in the array. The render method then gets called and maps out nothing, displays nothing to the view, and then after everything is inserted into the DOM, component did mount gets called, grabs our data, updates the post property to contain some data, and everything is re-rendered. So really important, whenever fetching data or making an asynchronous request, it's best to do it after the component is mounted, after it's inserted into the DOM and added to the view. And just a small aside, obviously everything else still works. The delete button still updates the component state such that it removes the chosen photo and re-renders the UI. Biggest takeaway here though, if you're ever fetching data from a database, make sure it's inside of component did mount. Do not make the mistake of placing your API request inside of component will mount. Component will mount, like the constructor, gets invoked before the component is inserted into the DOM, before the render method gets invoked. Best to do it inside of component did mount. Another lifecycle method that will probably come very useful to you eventually is component did update. Let's get a sneak preview of it now. This lifecycle method gets called whenever a component is re-rendered, or in other words, whenever we update the state of our component to trigger a re-render. Right now, as I mentioned several times, this render method gets called twice as we load the app. Since component did mount, right after the first render called, right after the component is inserted into the DOM, updates the state and triggers a re-render. So right after it triggers a re-render, we should expect component did update to get called. And whenever it gets called, we'll display an alert with message re-render. And when the app reruns, notice how the alert is displayed since component did mount is re-rendering our UI. Obviously, however, we're not really fetching any data from the web, so for the sake of keeping our code as simple as it can be, let's go back to initializing our component state post property with the array. Let's grab it from here and put it back as our initial state. Remove the function that we have over here. And you can simply remove this as well. We're not going to be using it anymore. It was just for demo purposes. As the app reruns, obviously the alert is not called because component.mount is not updating our component state and re-rendering the UI. However, when we press the remove button, we're updating the component state such that the post property filters out the image and re-renders the UI with the missing image. So obviously when we press remove, the lifecycle method was called and triggered our alert. You can also access the previous props and state of our component in the first and second arguments as previous props and previous state. And for now, just console.log previous state.posts. And inside of this method, we can also console.log the updated state, this.state. So at auto reload, if I were to remove a picture, well, you know what? Let me just get rid of the alert for now. As well as all of the other console.logs, they are going to get in the way. And back to my browser, I'm going to rerun this. All right, it rerun on its own. If I remove a picture, it prints out the previous state, which is 3 pictures, but the updated state only has 2, since we removed a picture. How would something like this be useful? Well, don't worry about that for now. I'll show you a better implementation of this later on in the course. And there are many other lifecycle methods in React, aside from constructor, render, did update, did mount, and will mount, most of which we'll implement as we go along with the course. But if you are curious about what they are right now, they are very well documented in the React documentation. If you don't feel like going over to the docs, don't worry, we'll implement more lifecycle methods as our app gets a little more complex. We don't need them at the moment. In the meantime, in the next section, we'll explore a very fundamental and crucial concept of React applications, and that is React routing. I'll see you then.